The wind in the Mesquite Divide had no manners. It came down from the high peaks tasting of iron and alkali, scouring the landscape until only the toughest things remained. It tore at the warped shingles of the Dry Comet Ranch, a name Rowan Pike's father had given the place with a dry laugh, saying it was a place you passed through quick or burned up standing still. Now, in the pale, dusty dawn of 1889, only Rowan remained. He was 25 years old, though the loneliness and the sun had etched lines around his eyes that belonged to a man twice that age. He'd been alone since the summer fever had taken his father, a swift, merciless heat that had left the small cabin smelling of sweat and herbal poultices, and then, finally, of nothing at all. The silence his father left behind was louder than any cattle stampede. Rowan moved before the sun crested the ridge, his motions economical, worn into grooves by habit. He stoked the stove, made coffee that was mostly hot water, and pulled on his boots. The leather was cracked, the soles thin. Everything on the Dry Comet was worn thin. He stepped onto the porch, his eyes automatically scanning the perimeter. Saguaro cactus stood like silent sentinels, their arms raised in permanent surrender to the sky. A kettle of crows argued over something dead near the eastern fence line. Everything was as it should be, until his gaze fell on the water cistern. It was the ranch's heart, a squat, wide cylinder of cedar wood bound with iron hoops, collecting the meager rainwater. Life and death in this territory was measured in feet from water. The lid was ajar. Rowan froze. The thick, heavy plank of cedar, weighing better than 100 pounds, was shifted a good 2 inches to the side. He set his coffee mug down on the porch rail, the tin making a hollow sound. He picked up the Winchester that never left the spot by the door. He didn't lever around into the chamber. The sound would carry, but he checked the magazine tube by feel. Full. He moved low and quick, keeping the cistern between himself and the barn. The dust around the cistern was disturbed. He knelt. The tracks were long, longer than his own boot print, and deeper in the heel. They were not the shuffling, dragging prints of a drifter dying of thirst. These were heavy, confident steps. The pattern wasn't a boot. It was a worn moccasin, or perhaps a foot wrapped in hide, and it was large. This was no stray child from a passing wagon. This was someone strong. He followed the tracks, his heart a dry knot in his chest. They led away from the cistern, not toward the open desert, but toward the cluster of outbuildings, the barn, the lean-to, and the storage shed where he kept his winter provisions. He smelled it before he saw it. Wood smoke. Not the mesquite he burned, but something different. Sage. The door to the storage shed was cracked open, a sliver of darkness against the graying light. He'd barred it last night. He knew he had. Rowan raised the Winchester, the stock smooth and cool against his cheek. He eased his weight onto the balls of his feet. He was a rancher, not a gunfighter. His hands were scored with rope burns and splinter scars, not notches. But the law of the divide was simple. You protected your water, and you protected your food. Failure to do either was just a slow way of dying. He pushed the door open with the rifle barrel. It scraped on the hard-packed dirt floor. The darkness inside was thick, smelling of salt-cured bacon, burlap, and cornmeal. For a second, he saw nothing. Then, a shape detached itself from the shadows in the back corner. It was a woman, but that word felt small, wrong. She was tall, impossibly tall, standing nearly level with his own 6 feet. Her shoulders were broad, filling the space. She wore buckskin leggings and a loose tunic, worn dark with travel. A quiver of arrows was slung across her back, and a bow of polished wood was gripped in her left hand. In her right, resting calmly at her side, was a knife. It was not a steel trade knife. The blade was milky white, chipped from bone, bound to a wooden handle with sinew. She was Apache, and she was not scrambling to escape. She was watching him. She had been packing. A burlap sack at her feet was half full of dried jerky. Another held cornmeal. A block of salt was tucked under her arm. This was Na Lavena Chenoa, though Rowan only knew her by the name whispered in the saloons in Tucson, a name spoken with a mix of fear and grudging awe by the settlers and prospectors. the White Mountain eldest sister. They said she led the last remnants of her band, ghosts who lived in the high rocks where the cavalry was too smart to go. Rowan's rifle was centered on her chest. The brass bead of his front sight was steady. Or it tried to be. He saw his own hands shaking. It was not from fear, not entirely. It was the shock. It was the crushing weight of his solitude suddenly broken by a presence this large, this real, this dangerous. It had been months since he had spoken to another human being face to face for longer than 5 minutes. The sheer, terrifying proximity of her made the air in his lungs feel thin. Her eyes met his. They were not the eyes of a cornered animal. They were dark, hard as obsidian, but clear. She was measuring him. She gauged the tremor in his hand, the uncertainty in his posture. She noted the rifle, the finger on the trigger, and the angle of the morning light. She was not afraid. She was calculating. The silence stretched. It pulled taut, brittle as dried hide. He had 2 choices. He could pull the trigger. It was his right. This was his land, his food. The law would stand by him. Or he could lower the rifle, and in doing so, break a code that had kept lesser men alive. He would be choosing the man over the law. His throat was sandpaper. He tried to speak, and the word came out as a cracked, hoarse sound, torn from a disused part of him. Don't! Nalavena Chenoa froze, but it was not the freeze of surrender. Her shoulders, already straight, tightened. She became a bowstring pulled to its absolute limit, waiting for the release, ready to spring forward with the bone knife, to cross the 10 feet between them before he could fire a second time. She expected the shot. Rowan took 1 slow step backward. The motion was so unexpected it seemed to break the tension. He lowered the barrel of the Winchester toward the floor. With his free hand, he gripped the edge of the shed door and pulled it wide open, flooding the space with the pale gold of the new morning. The light caught the high planes of her face, the strong line of her jaw, the dark, unbound hair. "Take what you need," Rowan said, his voice clearer this time, though it felt strange in his own ears. "Then go." Nava watched him for another long second. Her gaze did not soften. She was reading the fine print of his offer, searching for the trap. She found none. Slowly, she bent down. She did not take her eyes off him. She looped the drawstrings of the 2 heavy sacks and slung one over her shoulder. The other she gripped in her hand. She stood to her full height again. She walked toward the door, toward him. Rowan did not move. He kept the rifle pointed at the ground, but his thumb was on the hammer. She passed him so closely that the burlap sack brushed his shirt. He was enveloped in her scent. It was not the unwashed smell of a drifter. It was the clean, sharp scent of the high desert itself, crushed sage, wood smoke, and something else. Something metallic and warm, like the air before a lightning strike. She stepped out into the sunlight. She did not thank him. She did not look back. She simply walked, her stride long and even, carrying the heavy bags as if they were empty. Rowan stayed in the doorway of the shed, the rifle heavy in his grasp. He watched her cross the barren yard, past the cistern she had opened, past the empty corral. She moved like a shadow, stretching, silent and smooth. She did not run. She did not hurry. She owned the ground she crossed. He watched until she reached the edge of the ranch line, where a thin grove of cottonwood trees marked a dry wash, a good 50 yards away. There, she stopped. For a moment, she stood perfectly still, a tall silhouette against the brightening sky. Then, slowly, she turned. She was too far away for him to read her expression. She was just a shape, but he felt her gaze land, not on him, but on the house, the small, silent, lonely house. Nalavena stared at the simple structure. It was a box of human isolation, just like her own. For 6 months, ever since she had buried her husband, her heart had been a cold stone packed with grief and a silent, burning anger. She survived. She provided. She felt nothing else. But looking at that house, at the solitary figure who had lowered his gun when he should have raised it, something else stirred. It was a small, dangerous seed of curiosity. It was the first thing she had felt besides rage in a long, long time. She held the man's gaze for a count of 3, then turned and disappeared into the cottonwoods, leaving Rowan Pike alone once more, in a silence that suddenly felt heavier and more complicated than before. For 3 days, the Dry Comet Ranch was a prison of observation. Rowan Pike worked. It was all he knew how to do. He rode the eastern fence line, the section his father had always called the Devil's Backbone, a stretch of rocky, unforgiving ground that seemed to push fence posts back up as fast as he could sink them. He dug new holes with a heavy, splintered post digger, his shoulders burning, the sweat stinging his eyes. And he felt her. It was not a sound. The desert was filled with sounds, the skitter of a lizard, the dry rustle of a tumbleweed, the high, thin cry of a hawk. He knew those. This was a silence. It was a weight in the air, a pressure against the back of his neck. He would stop, his arms aching, and stand very still, scanning the jagged ridgeline. He would see nothing but shimmering heat and rock, but the feeling remained. It was the absolute certainty of being watched by an intelligence that was patient, quiet, and missed nothing. He told himself it was the solitude. He was a young man living like a hermit, and the empty spaces were starting to play tricks on his mind. But he knew it was a lie. He had been alone for months, and the loneliness was a dull ache, a familiar companion. This was new. This was sharp. He worked with his Winchester strapped to his saddle, a thing he rarely did, and he kept the horse closer than usual. He found himself clumsy, dropping his fencing tool, fumbling the staples. His focus was split, one half on the wire he was stretching, the other on the vast, empty landscape that he now knew was not empty at all. On the 3rd day, the pressure was so intense it was like a physical touch. He was twisting a new strand of barbed wire, the metal biting into his leather gloves. He stopped mid-motion. He did not turn. He simply ceased all movement, the sun beating on his hat. He let out a slow breath. He finished the twist, the wire groaning. He tucked the tool into his belt. He straightened up, wiping the grime from his face with his forearm. Then, slowly, he turned around. She was there. He had been scanning the high rocks, the places of ambush. He had been looking for a flicker of movement, a shadow that did not belong. He had been looking for a hunter. She was not hunting. She was not hiding. She was sitting on a massive, rotted log that marked the boundary of his property, perhaps 70 yards from where he stood. She sat as if she were sitting on a comfortable porch swing. Her back was straight, her hands clasped around one knee. Her bow and quiver lay in the dust beside her. She was simply watching him work, as a neighbor might watch a field being plowed. The audacity of it made Rowan's blood run cold, then hot. She was claiming a right to be there, a right to observe, that no settler would have dared. He left his horse. He walked toward her. His boots made soft, crunching sounds in the gravel. He was unarmed, save for the skinning knife at his belt. He felt the vulnerability of it, but he also knew that to retrieve his rifle now would be an act of aggression, an answer to a question she had not asked. He closed the distance, 40 yards, 30. He could see the detail of her face now, the dark, smooth skin, the absolute stillness of her expression. She did not move. She just watched him come. He stopped 10 feet from her, at the invisible line in the dust. He was breathing hard, not from the walk, but from the confrontation. For a long moment, they just stared. The wind whistled through the barbs on the wire he had just strung. Then she stood. She did not spring to her feet. She rose in a single, fluid motion, unfolding to her full height. Rowan was a tall man, but she was barely an inch shy of him, and she was built. The outline of her shoulders and arms under the buckskin tunic was not the lean, stringy muscle of a runner. It was the dense, powerful build of someone who carried heavy loads and drew a powerful bow. She was, as his father would have said, built like a well rope, solid and coiled and immensely strong. "Why do you keep coming back?" Rowan asked. His voice was rough. She tilted her head, a small, assessing motion. He heard her voice for the first time. It was lower than he expected, and clear, with no tremor in it. "You are not what I have seen." Rowan frowned. "What have you seen?" "Violence," she said. Her eyes scanned his face, his work-worn clothes, his empty hands. "Deceit, the things white men carry, the things they bring with them, like a sickness, and leave behind in the dirt." It was a test, a blade laid flat against his throat, testing for a flinch. He was supposed to argue. He was supposed to defend himself, to bluster about property and law. Rowan thought of the men in Tucson, of the casual cruelty he had seen, of the smugness of the land agents, of the way the marshals treated any native who was not already broken. He could not find a defense. He swallowed, the sound dry in his throat. He looked down at his own hands, scarred and dirty from the fence wire. He gave a single, sharp nod, accepting the judgment. The small motion seemed to surprise her. The hardness in her eyes did not fade, but it shifted. "Rowan," he said, looking back up at her. "My name is Rowan Pike." She held his gaze. She had offered a challenge. He had offered a truth. She seemed to weigh this new currency. "Nalevena," she replied. The syllables fell into the silence like stones dropped into a still, deep canyon. "Nalevena." She said nothing more. After a moment, she bent, retrieved her bow and quiver, and turned. She walked back into the rocks, not with the disappearing speed of the other day, but with a measured, deliberate pace. The meeting was over. Rowan stood by the fence line for a long time. He did not get any more work done that day. He saw her again the next morning. He was on the porch, where the dawn light was best, trying to repair a split bridle strap. He was rubbing Neat's foot oil into the stiff leather, his head down, focused on the task. The smell of the oil and the worn horse sweat of the leather was sharp in the cool air. He heard no footstep, no scrape of a boot. He only felt a change in the light, a shadow falling over his work. He looked up, and his heart leaped into his throat. She was on the porch. She had not stopped at the fence. She had not paused in the yard. She had walked directly to his house, climbed the 3 wooden steps, and was standing not 3 paces from his chair. He froze, the oily rag in his hand. He could see the amber flecks in her dark eyes. He could see the faint scar that ran from the corner of her left eye to her hairline. He could smell the sage and the smoke again, clean and wild. Her eyes flicked down to the broken bridle in his lap, then back to his face. A flicker of something that was not aggression moved in their depths. It was a faint, dangerous spark of amusement. "You fear me," she stated. It was not a question. Rowan's mouth was dry. He could feel the pulse in his neck, a frantic bird beating against a cage. He thought of the shed, of the bone knife, of the solid strength of her. He could lie. He could puff up his chest and deny it. But he knew, instinctively, that a lie would be the end of whatever this was. "Maybe," he admitted, his voice barely a murmur. "A little." A corner of her mouth lifted, a motion so slight it was barely a smile. "Good," she said. "Fear keeps men alive." She held the silence, and Rowan found he could not move. He was trapped in the intensity of her gaze, a man who had forgotten the language of human interaction, facing a woman who spoke a dialect he had never known. He should stand. He should ask her what she wanted. He did neither. She took 1 step closer. She was so close now he could feel a faint warmth radiating from her. She leaned in, not far, just enough to bridge the small, charged space between them. She lowered her voice, not to a whisper, but to a tone that was intimate, absolute, and meant only for him. It was a sound designed to cut through every defense he had. "I have not lain with a man in 6 months." Rowan went rigid. The air punched out of his lungs. Every muscle in his body locked, his back ramming against the hard slats of the chair. He felt the blood drain from his face, then rush back in a burning tide. His heart, which had been hammering, struck a single, painful blow, like a hammer hitting an anvil. It was not a statement of desire. It was a statement of fact, as raw and as dangerous as the bone knife at her hip. Before he could find breath, before he could form a single word or thought, she straightened up, The amusement in her eyes was gone, replaced by that same sharp, assessing look. She had thrown the rock. She had seen the water break. She turned, stepped off the porch, and walked across the yard, her long strides eating the ground. She did not look back. Rowan sat frozen, the bridle forgotten in his lap, the oily rag gripped in his fist. He stared out at the empty yard, his heart pounding a violent, painful rhythm against his ribs, a rhythm that was not from labor and not from fear. He was still locked in that ringing silence, the broken bridle heavy in his lap. When the sound came, it was not the wind, and it was not a coyote. It was the crack of a dry branch in the cottonwood grove, followed by the unmistakable, heavy tread of men wearing boots. Not one man, several. They were moving without care, making no effort to conceal their approach. Before Rowan could even think to stand, Nalavena's head snapped toward the sound. The transformation was absolute. It was faster than a hawk striking. The assessing, almost playful woman who had stood before him evaporated. In her place was something else, something terrifyingly competent, her entire body realigned, her weight shifting to the balls of her feet. Her eyes went flat and hard. Her focus narrowed to the tree line. The warrior had surfaced. Rowan scrambled to his feet, dropping the leather straps. He felt nakedly exposed on the porch, his rifle yards away, leaning inside the cabin door. 3 men emerged from the cottonwoods. They were Apache, but they were nothing like her. They were younger, broader, and they moved with a restless, angry energy. They wore a mix of traditional leggings and stained cavalry jackets. Their leader, a man with a flat, broken nose and eyes like chips of black glass, barked a single word. It was not a greeting. It was a command. Nava did not move. She held her ground on the top step, placing herself between the men and Rowan's open doorway. The lead warrior strode into the yard, his 2 companions fanning out to his sides. He stopped 20 feet from the porch. He ignored Rowan completely, as one might ignore a piece of ranch furniture. His furious gaze was locked on Nava. He spoke again, a string of guttural, clipped syllables that struck the air like thrown hatchets. He was enraged, gesturing angrily first at her, then back toward the mountains. Rowan stood frozen, his hands half raised in a useless gesture of placation. He was empty-handed, out of his depth, an intruder in a language and a conflict he could not understand. He just knew not to make any sudden moves, Nava replied. Her voice was calm, but it was not the low, intimate tone she had used with him. This was the voice he had heard in the shed. It was sharp and formal, each word a parry to the man's thrusts. She spoke, and the leader cut her off, spitting another, longer sentence. And then he said a name that seemed to land like a physical blow. Kozani Grey Wolf. Rowan did not understand the name, but he saw the effect. Nava's shoulders, which had been set and straight, clenched. It was a flicker of movement, a tightening of the muscles so severe it looked painful. It was the first sign of weakness, the first crack in her armor, and the lead warrior saw it. He pressed the advantage, stepping closer to the porch, his voice dropping to a low, menacing growl. He was issuing an ultimatum. Nava's gaze flickered, for just 1 second. To Rowan, he saw the calculation in her eyes. He saw the trap. These men were here for her. But his presence, the house, the ranch, he was the complication. Her being here had put him in the center of their anger. She looked back at the leader. She gave a single, sharp nod. The tension broke, but it did not dissipate. It curdled. The leader grunted, satisfied. He jerked his head toward the trees. A command to move. Nava stepped down from the porch. She did not look at Rowan again, but as she passed the corner of the house, she paused. Her eyes met his across the yard. The look was not soft. It was not an apology. It was a promise, hard and clear as quartz. I will return. Then she turned and walked, not as a captive, but as someone biding her time. Flanked by the 3 warriors, they disappeared back into the dry wash, and the ranch was silent again, the yard empty. Rowan finally let out the breath he had been holding. It came out in a ragged, shaking gasp. He stumbled back and leaned against the porch post, his legs suddenly weak, his heart pounding a sick, heavy rhythm. 2 nights passed. The ranch was wrong. The silence he'd once found comforting was now filled with ghosts and echoes. He found himself unable to work, pacing the small cabin, moving from the window to the door, checking the ridge lines. He moved his cot from the wall and barricaded the door with it at night. A gesture he knew was futile. If they wanted to come in, they would. He was sitting in the dark kitchen, the moon a pale slit through the curtains, when he heard it, a tiny sound, a tick, tick, tick against the glass of the window. He froze. It was not the heavy-handed approach of the warriors. It was deliberate, quiet. He slid off the cot, the rope springs groaning, and grabbed the Winchester. He moved to the door. "Who's there?" he whispered, his mouth close to the wood. A pause, then her voice, so low it was almost just a breath of air. "Rowan." He fumbled with the bar, his hands shaking, and pulled the door open. She slipped inside like a shadow, a deeper darkness moving through the doorway. He shut the door and dropped the bar back in place, his heart hammering. He turned and fumbled for the matching. "No light," she commanded, her voice strained. He stopped, his hand hovering in the dark. He could hear her breathing. It was fast and shallow, the breathing of a spent runner. "What happened?" he asked the darkness. "They followed you." "They are coming," she said, and the words were tight, pained. "But not yet. Soon." His eyes were adjusting. He could see her silhouette against the slightly paler rectangle of the window. She was standing in the center of the kitchen, her back to him, her head bowed. "Nava." She turned, and the moonlight caught the side of her face. He saw it clearly. A dark, ugly swelling high on her cheekbone, the skin broken, the area around her eye puffy and dark. "My God." He breathed. He took a step toward her. "Who did this?" "Kozani," she said, and the name was pure venom. "My brother. He struck me, because I refused the man he chose for me." Before Rowan could process the words, the sickness, the rage, he heard it, the distant sound of a horse neighing. Cut off quick. It was down by the main wash. Nava's head came up. "They are here." Rowan's mind raced. The cabin was a box. There was no back door. The windows were small. "In here," he said, acting on pure instinct. He grabbed her arm. Her skin was cold. He pulled her across the kitchen, to the far corner, where a thick woven rag rug lay over the floorboards. "Help me." He grabbed one end of the rug. She grabbed the other, and they threw it back, exposing a square trap door with an iron ring. "The food cellar," he grunted, pulling on the ring. The door lifted with a scrape of wood. A square of absolute black opened up. The smell of cold earth, potatoes, and cured salt pork rushed out. "Go," he urged. She looked at the black hole, then at him. There was no time for hesitation. She swung her legs down, found the first rung of the inset ladder, and descended. Rowan followed, pulling the door shut over his head. The darkness was total. It was thick, suffocating. He was on the ladder, his feet 2 rungs above her. He felt her shift at the bottom, moving onto the packed dirt floor. He climbed down the last rungs and stepped off, his shoulder colliding hard with hers. The space was tiny. It was a hole dug under his kitchen, not meant for 2 people. It was barely 7 feet square and not tall enough for him to stand upright. He was hunched, his head brushing the floor joists above. He felt her move beside him, settling against the earthen wall. He stood next to her, his side pressed against hers. They were trapped, shoulder to chest, hip to hip, breathing in the cold, damp air. And then they heard the boots on the porch. The sound was thunderous, magnified by the floorboards just inches above their heads. The cabin door smashed open, the bar splintering. Rowan felt Nava go perfectly still beside him. He held his own breath, his heart a-roaring in his ears. Heavy footsteps stomped across the kitchen. 1 set, 2, 3. They heard the scrape of a chair being kicked over. A man cursed, the voice muffled but clear. The footsteps moved through the small house, into the main room. They heard the cot being overturned, A crash of glass, the chimney from his oil lamp. Rowan's breath was trapped in his chest. He was pressed so tightly against Nava that he could feel the frantic, rabbit-quick pulse in her neck. He could feel the warmth of her through the 2 layers of their shirts. The footsteps returned to the kitchen. Right above them, a man stopped directly over the trap door. Rowan could hear the scuff of his boot on the floorboards, separated from his head by a single inch of wood. He closed his eyes. There was a sudden, violent crash, the sound of his pantry shelf being swept clear. Tin cans, plates, and jars smashed onto the floor. A voice called out in the Apache tongue. It sounded like the leader from the other day. Another man answered from outside. The boots stomped one last time, jarring dust from the joists onto Rowan's face. They moved toward the door. The footsteps receded, the men shouting to each other in the yard. A moment later, the cabin door slammed shut. Silence. Rowan and Nava did not move. They stood in the pitch black, their bodies locked together, listening. The silence from above was as terrifying as the noise had been. Rowan counted to 100, his lips not moving. Nothing. He let out a breath he had been holding for an eternity. It came out as a shudder. Beside him, he felt Nava's entire body sag, her head dropping forward, her forehead coming to rest against his shoulder. He could feel her trembling. The warrior was gone. The woman who had been struck by her brother, who had run through the dark, who had hidden in a hole in the ground, was all that was left. He did not know what else to do. He raised his hand, the one not pinned between his body and the wall, and placed it on her shoulder. His fingers found the damp buckskin, the solid muscle underneath. She did not pull away. Instead, she turned her head, her face pressing into the rough wool of his shirt. He felt a single, hot tear soak through the fabric. In the absolute, tomb-like darkness, a hand found his. Her fingers were cold, but her grip was strong. She wasn't just holding his hand, she was clutching it, her fingers digging into his palm, an anchor in the black. They stood like that for a long, long time, long after the last sound of the horses faded into the desert. The cellar, which had been a trap, a tomb, now felt like the only safe place in the world. It was a warm cocoon, filled with the scent of earth and their shared, ragged breathing. Rowan felt her shift, her hand loosening its grip, but not letting go, her fingers interlaced with his. He was acutely aware of her breath on his neck, of the side of her breast pressed against his arm, of the bruise he could not see but could feel, a center of pain in the dark. She lifted her head from his shoulder. He felt her turn her face toward his. He could not see her, but he knew. He felt her looking at him. He was not a brave man. He was a man defined by solitude and work. But in that moment, in the dark, he felt a different kind of courage. He leaned in, guided by nothing but the sound of her breath. He felt her hair brush his cheek. He found her mouth. It was not a gentle kiss. It was clumsy and desperate and trembling. It was the shock of contact, the taste of salt from her tear, the faint metallic tang of her skin. It was short, lasting only a second, but it was electric. It was a spark in the powder keg, a burning confirmation of life in a place that smelled of death and dirt. She made a small sound in the back of her throat, a sound of surprise, and her fingers tightened on his hand. He pulled back, his heart pounding so hard he thought it might break through his ribs. They stood in the dark, their lips inches apart, breathing the same air. The chase was over. Something else had just begun. They did not emerge from the cellar for almost an hour. They stood in the absolute, shared darkness. Long after the last hoofbeats faded, just breathing. The kiss, a desperate, clumsy collision, hung in the air between them, unspoken. It was too new, too raw to be examined. Rowan was the first to move. "They're gone," he whispered. His voice was a dry croak. He felt her nod against his shoulder. He found the ladder and climbed, his legs stiff. He pushed the trapdoor open, the sound of the scraping wood deafening in the silence. The kitchen was a violation. Sunlight, just beginning to peek over the eastern ridge, streamed in. illuminating the chaos. The chairs were overturned. His sack of flour had been slashed, a white, ghostly powder covering the floorboards. Smashed plates and tin cans littered the ground. They had been looking for something specific, or they had been enacting a blind, angry rage. Nava climbed out behind him, her movements fluid, but stiff. She stood in the center of the wreckage, her eyes taking in the destruction. The warrior was back. Her face was a mask of cold fury. But the moonlight from the window had not lied. The bruise high on her cheek was a dark, swollen map of betrayal. The skin split in the center. Rowan felt a sickness rise in his own throat, a rage that was cold and unfamiliar. He ignored the mess. He went to the water bucket by the door, the one they had somehow missed, and dipped a rag in the cold water. He wrung it out and turned to her. "Here," he said, holding it out. She stared at the rag, then at him. "Let me," he said, his voice quiet. He took a step. She flinched, a tiny, involuntary movement, as he raised his hand, but she did not pull away. She stood still, her body rigid, very gently. He lifted the damp cloth. He did not dab at the cut, but pressed the cold rag to the swelling around it. She closed her eyes, a long, shuddering breath escaping her. He was close enough to see the individual lashes resting on her unblemished cheek, the faint pulse at her temple. He held the cloth there until the cold of it faded, his knuckles brushing her hair. She did not leave. The attack had rewritten the terms. Her brother, Kozani, was not just angry, he was violent. To leave the ranch now was to walk back into his hands, to be dragged to a marriage she had refused. To stay was to put Rowan in the direct path of that violence. They did not speak of this. They did not speak of the kiss. Instead, they found a language they both understood. Rowan picked up the broom. Nava found the dustpan. For 3 days, they worked. They cleaned the kitchen, sweeping up the flour, salvaging what food they could, righting the furniture, the shared. Simple labor was a relief, a way to move and think without having to face the new, fragile thing that lay between them. On the second day, they moved outside. The eastern fence line, the one he had been working on, was their new project. Rowan dug the post holes, his muscles screaming in protest. Nava, working beside him, lifted and set the heavy cedar posts, tamping the earth around them with a rhythmic, efficient force that made his own efforts look strained. She worked with a silent, focused grace. She showed him, without words, how to use his weight on the tamping rod, to use the rhythm of his breathing to drive it home, rather than just the brute strength of his arms. He was the rancher, but she was the one who knew how to survive in this land. His horse, a sturdy bay gelding, shied from her at first. It snorted, its eyes rolling, smelling the wildness on her, the scent of the high rocks. Rowan, frustrated, grabbed for the halter. "He's always been skittish," he muttered. Nava put a hand on his arm, stopping him. "You move too fast," she said, her voice quiet. "You approach him like an enemy." She walked toward the horse, not from the front, but from the side, at the shoulder. She did not look at its face. She kept her eyes down, her body relaxed. She made a low, humming sound in her chest. The horse's ears flickered, then pricked forward. It stamped one foot, but held its ground. Nava put a hand on its neck and just stood there, breathing with the animal, until its head dropped and it let out a long, sighing breath. Later, she watched him saddle the horse. "Your cinch knot is wrong," she said. He bristled. "It's the knot my father taught me. It holds." "It holds," she agreed. "But it binds, and it is slow." She took the leather strap from his hand. Her fingers moved in a quick, intricate pattern, a series of loops and twists he had never seen. "This is a mountain hitch. It holds just as tight, but she pulled one end of the strap. It releases with one pull. When you need to be free, you do not have time to fight a knot." He watched her strong, capable hands, and he felt the truth of her words. He was learning. The afternoon of the third day found them in the barn. The air was thick and golden, choked with dust motes dancing in the light that streamed through the warped boards. The smell of dry hay, old leather, and horse was a warm, close blanket. Rowan was back at the workbench, trying again to fix the broken bridle strap. His fingers, calloused and sore from the post digger, were clumsy. Nava was beside him, sorting through a pile of old harnesses, salvaging the good leather. They both reached for the small, round tin of saddle soap at the same time. His hand, rough and dirty, brushed against the back of hers. The contact was like a spark from a flint, sharp and hot. Rowan jerked his hand back as if he had touched a hot stove. "Sorry," he mumbled, his face flushing. He stared down at the workbench. "Pardon me." Nava did not move. She left her hand resting on the bench, palm up, next to the tin. The silence in the barn stretched, broken only by the soft stamp of the horse in its stall. "Rowan." He looked up. Her dark eyes were steady, unblinking in the dusty light. "Do not apologize for touching me," she said. Her voice was very low. He swallowed. I just meant, do not," she said, cutting him off, her voice firm but not angry. "Apologize for it, not unless you did not want to." The air in the barn became thin, hard to breathe. He stared at her, at the woman who had fought, who had run, who had worked beside him, and who was now laying down a new law. The bruise on her cheek had faded to a sickly map of purple and yellow, a reminder of the brutality she had fled. "Want to?" he finally managed, his voice rough. "Nava, that's the problem. I don't know what I want. Not really." He turned away from her, running a hand through his sweat-damp hair, the gesture one of pure frustration. "I've been alone for so long. You live like this. You forget how to be around another person. You get set in your ways. And then you—" He trailed off. He turned back to face her. "And then you're here, and I am afraid." She watched his face, her own expression unreadable. "You are not a coward, Rowan. I have seen you." "That's not what I mean." The confession spilled out of him, as if a dam had broken. "I am not afraid of you. I'm afraid of this." He made a vague gesture between the two of them. "I'm afraid of this feeling, this want. I'm afraid of losing control. I'm afraid I'll do something wrong, or say the wrong thing, and break it." He looked at her bruise. "I'm afraid of getting you hurt, worse than you already are. I'm afraid of your brother." The words hung in the charged air, raw and terribly honest. She looked down at her own hands, resting on the bench. "6 months ago," she said, her voice so quiet he had to lean in to hear it. "I buried my husband. He was a good man, a strong hunter. He died in an ambush." She traced the grain of the wooden bench with one finger. "When I buried him, I put a stone in my heart. I swore I would never open that door again, to feel this. It costs too much. It is a weakness, to feel nothing." She looked up, her gaze locking with his. "Is to be safe. Are you safe, Nava?" he asked, his voice just as quiet. She held his gaze, and for the first time, he saw the deep, aching vulnerability beneath the warrior's strength. She did not have to look at the bruise. "No," she whispered. He took one step, then another. He stood directly in front of her, so close he could feel the warmth radiating from her, see the fine, dark hairs on her temple. He raised his hand, very slowly, giving her every second to stop him, to pull away. He did not touch her mouth. He did not touch her bruise. He laid his calloused, dirty palm against the unblemished side of her face. Her skin was warm, softer than he could have imagined. She did not flinch. She did not pull back. She leaned into his touch, a small, weary movement, and her eyes drifted closed. "I don't know what I'm doing," he whispered, his thumb brushing the high arch of her cheekbone. "Nor do I," she breathed, the words a ghost of a sound. He leaned in. This was not the kiss from the cellar. That had been darkness and panic and desperation. This was a choice, made in the dusty, golden light. His lips met hers with a tenderness that surprised him. It was a question, the exploration. It was slow. For a moment, there was just the gentle pressure, a learning, Then, with a soft, sighing breath, her lips parted under his, it was a kiss of shared admission, of shared fear. He tasted the salt of her skin and the dust of the day. Her hands came up, not to grab him, but to rest on his shoulders, her fingers gripping the rough fabric of his shirt. Steadying herself, they stood like that for a long, quiet moment, just learning how to breathe together. When he finally pulled back, he did not go far. He rested his forehead against hers. Her eyes were still closed. He felt her heart beating against his chest, a deep, heavy rhythm that matched his own. They had, both of them, taken a step off a cliff, and they had not fallen. The sound of a horse, ridden too hard and too fast, shattered the moment. Nava's eyes snapped open. The softness was gone, replaced by the warrior. She was across the barn and in the shadows of an empty stall before Rowan had even fully turned, the bone knife appearing in her hand as if by magic. Rowan stepped out of the barn, his heart pounding a different, colder rhythm. He shaded his eyes against the sun. It was Jed Olson, his neighbor from 5 miles south. Jed was a scarecrow of a man, his face a roadmap of worry. He was riding his horse at a dangerous, panicked gallop. "Rowan!" Jed shouted, sawing on the reins, his horse lathered and wild-eyed. "Rowan! You seen me?" "Seen who?" "Jed. The railroad. A whole crew, but they ain't laying track. Son, they're surveying water." Jed spat a stream of tobacco juice. "They got a Pinkerton with me, a hard case named Elias Dorn." Rowan felt the ground shift beneath him. "They're working for Caleb Vance." Jed rushed on, his voice cracking. "The Silver Meridian line. They was at my place not an hour ago. Said my spring was on their charter grant. Offered me 10 cents on the dollar for my land. 10 cents said if I didn't take it, they'd condemn it." "Condemn my water? What did you do?" "Jed." "What could I do?" Jed's voice was thin. "I told me to get that Dorn. He just smiled. Rowan, he just smiled. He said he'd be back. They're heading this way. They're checking every spring in the divide." Jed didn't wait for a reply. He kicked his exhausted horse and galloped off, a plume of dust rising behind him. Rowan stood in the empty yard, the man's panic hanging in the air. He had one fire in his house, and now another, a bigger one, was burning its way up the valley. He turned and walked back into the barn. Nava stepped out of the shadows. The knife was gone, but her face was grim. "I heard," she said. Rowan nodded, his mind racing, trying to catch up. Caleb Vance. He remembered the name from wanted posters. A man in a suit, not a saddle. He stared at the ground, a memory surfacing. My father, just before he died. He was rambling, with the fever. He looked up at Nava, his eyes sharp. He kept saying something about a map, an old, forgotten survey. He said, "The first survey is the true survey." He said he hit it. Nava's expression tightened. A map. He was a surveyor, for the government, before he ever put a cow on this land. Years ago. Nava stepped into the light, her eyes like polished stones. "My husband was killed tracking a new survey crew 6 months ago." The words fell into the silence, hard and heavy. The pieces were jagged, but they were starting to fit. The truth. "Rowan," Nava said, her voice low and fierce, "is sharper than a blade, and it cuts deeper." She looked past him, out the barn door, toward the valley where the railroad men were coming. "These men, Vance and Dorn, they are like my brother. They take what they want. They use lies, and then they use force." He looked at her, this woman, his opposite in every way, who was now the only ally he had in the world. The fear he had confessed was still there, but it was hardening, crystallizing into something else, something solid. They did not need to speak the vow. It was made in the silence, in the dusty, golden light. The fight for his land and the fight for her freedom were not two separate things. They were one. And if they were to have this fragile new beginning, they would have to stand together in the fire that was coming. Jed Olson's dust cloud was long gone, but his panic remained, a sour taste in the air. The sun was dipping low, painting the undersides of the clouds a bruised purple. The truce of shared labor was over. The kiss in the barn felt like it had happened a lifetime ago. "The trunk," Rowan said, breaking the silence. He kept it at the foot of his bed. He never opened it. They went inside the small cabin. The wrecked kitchen was clean, but the memory of the violation was fresh. In the main room, a single cot was pressed against one wall, and at its foot was a heavy pine chest, bound with black iron. It was not locked. Rowan lifted the lid. The hinges groaned in protest. The smell of cedar, old wool, and dry, brittle paper rolled out. It was the smell of a life packed away. On top lay his father's Sunday suit, neatly folded and smelling of mothballs. Beneath that, a set of daguerreotypes in velvet cases. Rowan set them aside. At the very bottom, wrapped in oilcloth, was a thick leather-bound ledger and a small, heavy object. He brought them to the table. Nava stood opposite him, her arms crossed, her shadow long in the lamplight he had lit. He untied the oilcloth. The book was a surveyor's field journal. The pages were thick, filled with his father's precise, angular handwriting, columns of numbers, and intricate, hand-drawn maps. The other object was a brass disc, heavy in his palm. The letters U.S. Survey stamped into it. The section and range numbers worn almost smooth. "This is it," Rowan breathed. He opened the journal. The first pages were mundane. Property lines, creek beds, mineral notations. But then he found it. Halfway through, a map drawn with black India ink, covering 2 full pages. It was a section of the Mesquite Divide, but it was older than any map Rowan had ever seen. The property lines were different. His own ranch, the Dry Comet, was marked, but its boundaries were smaller, and there, clear as day, was the spring. His finger traced the delicate blue line his father had drawn. Saguaro Wash Spring. He read the neat script. "Look," he pointed. The spring was not on his land. It was not on the parcel marked as belonging to the territorial government, the one the railroad was claiming. According to this map, this original survey, the spring was located on a wide, protected swath of land designated simply Apache, Ash Mesa territory, unceded. Vance's papers. Rowan's mind was racing. My deed. It must be based on a newer survey. A false one. This. He tapped the page. This is the original. This is the truth his fever was trying to remember. He looked up at Nava, his eyes wide with the implications. "The spring isn't mine, but it damn sure isn't the railroad's. It's yours." Nava was not looking at the spring. Her gaze was fixed on a small symbol drawn just west of the water source, a series of 3 triangles inside a circle. Her face had gone pale beneath the bruise. "Ash Mesa," she said, her voice a low, tight wire. "That's what it says," Rowan confirmed, pointing to the script. "Ash Mesa Valley. This is where my husband died." The words dropped into the room, heavy and cold. Rowan froze. "He and 2 others went hunting," Nava said, her eyes locked on the map, as if seeing a ghost in the ink. "They were found there, ambushed, filled with rifle bullets, not arrows. Nava, it was 6 months ago." She looked up, her gaze pinning him. "The same week, a new survey crew, men I did not recognize, was seen on the ridge. My husband went to find out who they were. He never came back." The pieces clicked together, sharp and ugly. Vance, needing the water, had hired a new survey team to move the spring onto railroad land, creating new maps and new deeds. But Nava's husband and his father's old, true map were the 2 things that stood in their way. One had been eliminated with bullets. The other had been buried in a trunk. "They murdered him," Rowan said, the words tasting like ash. "They murdered him to steal this water, and they will murder again to keep it." Nava's hand rested on the map, her fingers tracing the valley where her life had changed. Rowan flipped through the rest of the journal, his hands shaking with a cold rage. Tucked into the back cover, folded small, was a single sheet of paper. It was not a map. It was a receipt on the letterhead of the Tucson County Clerk's office. It was a bill for expedited filing and charter verification. The sum was staggering. Over $500, paid by a holding company Rowan had never heard of. But it was not the sum that made his blood run cold. It was the signature at the bottom, authorizing the filing. A looping, arrogant script he had seen on foreclosure notices all over the territory. Judge Harlan Merriweather. "The court," Rowan whispered. "It's not just Vance. It's the law. Merriweather is in on it. He's the one who made the false deeds legal." Nava looked at the signature. "Paper," she said. "That shoots like a gun." A sound from outside broke the spell. A horse's whinny, sharp and close. Nava was moving before the sound finished. She blew out the lantern, plunging the room into darkness. "Riders," she hissed. "Too many." Rowan scrambled for the Winchester, his heart pounding. He peered through the slit in the curtain. 3? No. 4 men on horseback were in his yard. Dark shapes against the twilight. One of them, sitting tall in the saddle, wore a duster and a flat-brimmed hat. "It's Dorn," Rowan breathed. "The Pinkerton." "The book," Nava said, her voice urgent in the dark. "They are here for the book. They know Jed came here." Rowan looked around frantically. "The cellar, no, they'd search it. The trunk, too obvious. The barn," he said. "We have to draw them out. Distract them." Nava nodded, already understanding. "I will go. Out the back. I will light the lantern in the hayloft. They will think we are hiding there. It will give you time." "Nava, no, it's too dangerous." "You are a bad liar," she said, her voice a ghost of a smile. "But you are a worse runner. Give me the matches." He pressed the tin into her hand. "Be careful." "Go," she commanded. She slipped out the back door, silent as smoke. Rowan waited. His breath held. He counted to 30. A sudden shout from the yard. "Hey, in the barn, there's a light!" He heard the jingle of spurs, the thud of boots hitting the ground as the men dismounted. "Surround it," Dorn's voice boomed, full of cold authority. "2 of you with me, you. Stay with the horses." Rowan ran. He grabbed the journal and the brass marker from the table. He went to the wall beside the fireplace, where a section of planking had always been loose. He worked his fingers behind it, prying it open, the old wood groaning. He shoved the journal and the heavy brass disc into the dark, dusty space between the studs. He was forcing the plank back into place when a shadow fell over him. He spun, the rifle coming up, but he was too late. A man was in the doorway. But it was not Dorn. It was an Apache, and he was not one of the 3 who had taken Nava. It was Kozani, Nava's brother. He looked past Rowan, at the empty cabin. His eyes were bloodshot, his face slack with confusion, and he smelled of cheap whiskey. "Where is she?" Kozani demanded, his voice a slur. Before Rowan could answer, Dorn's voice cut through the night. "Clear, no one in the barn, it was a trick!" Footsteps thundered back toward the cabin. Kozani looked over his shoulder, panicked, then back at Rowan. Dorn stormed into the cabin, his pistol drawn. He was a thick, powerful man with a dead gray mustache and eyes to match. He took in Rowan, then Kozani, his lip curling in disgust. "Get out," he snarled at Kozani. Kozani hesitated, looking at Rowan with a burning, helpless hatred. "I said get out." Dorn shoved him hard. Kozani stumbled back, out into the yard. Dorn turned his cold eyes on Rowan. "Well, boy, you've had a busy night. Where is she?" "I don't know who you mean." Rowan kept the rifle level, but his hands were sweating. Dorn laughed, a dry, humorless sound. "Don't play stupid. It doesn't suit you. The Apache woman, and the book, the one old man Pike was babbling about." So they did know. They had been watching him. "I don't have any book," Rowan said. Dorn smiled. "Search the place," he yelled over his shoulder. His men tore the cabin apart. They were not looking for a person. They were looking for paper. They dumped the trunk, smashed the few remaining jars, and ripped the cot mattress open. Rowan stood by the fireplace, the rifle barrel shaking slightly. knowing that Dorn would shoot him without a second's thought. Nava was gone. She had drawn them away and vanished. "It ain't here, boss," one of the men said, kicking the ruined mattress. Dorn's smile faded. He stared at Rowan, his eyes probing. "You're a poor rancher, Pike, but you're a worse liar. I'll be back, and when I am, I'll burn this place to the ground, with you in it." He turned to the doorway, where Kozani was still hovering. "Here," Dorn said, tossing him a dark glass bottle. "Your pay. Now go tell your sister the deal stands. She comes to me, or I come for all of you. And I want more than just guns and whiskey tomorrow. I want her." Kozani caught the bottle, his gaze dropping to the ground, a picture of shame and rage. He turned and disappeared into the night. Dorn gave Rowan one last, promising look. "This ain't over." They mounted up and rode out, their horses kicking up divots in the yard. Rowan stood in the ruined doorway, his knuckles white on the rifle. He had not seen Nava. He had not seen where she had gone. And then, the first drop of rain hit his face. It was not a drizzle. It was a deluge. The sky opened, the first storm of the season breaking over the divide. A crack of lightning illuminated the yard, and the heavens unleashed a torrent. The wind howled, and the rain came down in solid, driving sheets, turning the dust to instant, thick mud. He saw her then, a shadow detaching itself from the side of the cistern. She was soaked, her hair plastered to her face, but she was unharmed. She walked to the porch, the rain sluicing off her. She looked at the ruined cabin, then at the wall where the book was hidden. Then she looked out at the storm, which was already obliterating the hoofprints of Dorn's horses. "He is working with them," she said. Her voice was flat, dead, devoid of all emotion. "My brother, for whiskey, for guns." Rowan had no words. He could only stand there, watching the pain that was colder and deeper than any bruise. She did not cry. She simply absorbed the betrayal, and it turned to steel inside her. "They'll be back," Rowan said, his voice hoarse. Dorn meant what he said. "Not tonight," Nava said, watching the mud. "This rain buys us time." "Tomorrow," Rowan said, his mind clearing. "At first light. We go to St. Elmo's Fork. There's a man there, Pastor Abel Sutter. My father said he was the only honest man in the territory, said he knew the law better than Meriwether ever will." Nava nodded once. They did not go inside. There was nothing left to save in the cabin. They sat on the wooden porch swing, side by side but not touching, listening to the roar of the rain on the tin roof. The storm was a curtain, sealing them off from the world. A flash of lightning lit up her face, the new, cold resolve in her eyes, the dried mark of her brother's betrayal on her cheek. Rowan did not speak. He just sat with her, a silent partner to her grief, a silent witness. The storm raged, but on the porch, a different, quieter promise was made. It was a vow taken between two people who had nothing left but a hidden truth and a shared enemy. They would not just survive. They would speak. The ride to St. Elmo's Fork was a cold, liquid misery. The storm that had bought them time also tried to drown them. They rode Rowan's single bay gelding, Nava riding behind him, her arms wrapped around his waist, her face pressed against his back for warmth. The world was reduced to the gray, driving sheets of rain, the sucking mud that grabbed at the horses' hooves, and the howl of the wind. Rowan had retrieved the journal and the brass marker from the wall, wrapping them in the oilcloth and securing them in his saddlebag. They were the only dry things they owned. By the time they reached the cluster of abandoned adobe buildings that marked Coyote Gate, the horse was trembling with exhaustion, and they were both soaked to the bone, their bodies numb. The chapel was just as Rowan's father had described it, a small, crumbling structure with a missing bell, its doors long since blown away. But beside it, the sexton's storage shed was intact, its heavy plank door still barred. Rowan slid from the saddle, his legs buckling from the cold. He helped Nava down, his hands spanning her waist. She was shaking, her teeth chattering so hard he could hear them click. He forced the bar back and shoved the door open. The shed was a black square, but it was dry. The air was still and thick with the smell of old wood, dust, and dried herbs. He led the horse into the narrow walkway, its bulk immediately filling the space, and pulled the door shut, sealing them in. Darkness. Rowan fumbled in his coat for the match tin. His fingers were numb. Useless clubs. Here. Nava's voice was a low tremor beside him. He felt her hands cover his, guiding his fingers, her own just as cold but impossibly steady. She struck the match. The sudden flare was blinding. Rowan found a storm lantern on a shelf, its glass globe miraculously intact. He lit the wick. A pool of weak, golden light spread, illuminating a small, cramped space, packed with broken furniture, rotting sacks of lime, and old church implements. In the corner, a pile of thick, coarse wool blankets, likely used for padding furniture, sat dry and untouched. He turned to her. The lantern light was cruel. Her buckskin tunic was plastered to her, dark and heavy with water. Her hair was a black river running down her back, and tiny, perfect droplets clung to the fine, dark hairs of her collarbone. Catching the light like jewels, he grabbed the topmost blanket, a heavy, gray thing, and shook the dust from it. He stepped toward her. "You have to get warm," he said, his own voice chattering. He held the blanket open. She looked at him, her dark eyes hollowed out by exhaustion. She did not move. He reached out and put his hand on her arm to guide her. His hand slid down to her wrist, and he felt the frantic, icy pulse beneath her cold, wet skin. His own hand was shaking, not just from the cold, but from the stark, terrifying vulnerability of her. This was not the warrior. This was not the woman who had tested him on the porch. This was a person at the very end of her strength. She let him wrap the blanket around her shoulders. He pulled it tight, his movements clumsy, tucking it under her chin. His hand was still on her shoulder, and the light from the lantern fell across her face, illuminating the faded, ugly bruise on her cheekbone. He saw it not as a mark of her brother's violence, but as his own failure. A failure to protect her, a failure to have been there. He did not think. He lifted his other hand, the one that was not holding the blanket, and laid his palm flat against the bruise. He did not rub. He did not stroke. He just held it there, his calloused, rain-wrinkled skin covering the mark. A silent, desperate apology for the cruelty of men. He expected her to pull away. He expected the warrior to surface, to shove him back for the presumption. She did not. She closed her eyes. Her whole body, which had been rigid with cold, seemed to soften, with a long, sighing breath that shuddered out of her. She leaned forward and rested her forehead against his. His heart stopped. He was perfectly still, his hand on her face, her forehead against his, the heavy wool blanket bunched between them. He felt her breath, warm for the first time, ghost across his chin. He was just a rancher, solitary and awkward. But in that moment, his wide shoulders, which had only ever hauled feed and dug post holes, became the only solid thing in the world. He was a rock, and she was, for just this 1 second, leaning on him. He could feel the fine tremor running through her. He could smell the rain in her hair and the sage that was always, somehow, part of her. The silence in the shed was absolute, broken only by the muffled drum of the storm outside and the sound of 2 people breathing. Her hands, which had been trapped inside the blanket, moved. She found his, the one still holding the wool tight at her shoulder. She did not push it away. Her cold fingers closed around his wrist, holding him there. The touch, a simple grip, was more profound than the kiss in the cellar. It was a choice. He slowly moved his other hand from her face, tracing the line of her jaw, his thumb brushing her chapped lower lip. She did not flinch. He cupped her chin. "Nava," he whispered. Just her name. She lifted her head from his, but only an inch. Her eyes, when they opened, were dark pools, the amber flecks ignited by the lantern light. He saw his own reflection in them. He saw the man she was choosing to trust. He leaned in, and this time there was no desperation, no fear. This was an answer to a question they had both been asking. The kiss was deep, but it was incredibly gentle. It was a kiss of profound relief, a kiss of sanctuary. It was a slow, mutual listening. His lips learned the shape of hers, the faint tremor that remained. Her hands slid up from his wrists to his shoulders, gripping him, not in passion, but in a need for solid ground. It was a long, unhurried exploration, a promise given and received in the same motion. When they parted, there was no awkwardness, there was no fear. They were just two people, in a dry shed, while the world tried to wash them away. In a dark corner, he found an old wooden crate filled with dry, rough-spun clothes left behind by some long-gone sexton. They were stiff and smelled of dust, but they were dry. Shielding the lantern, they turned their backs to each other, the small space granting them a courtesy. They stripped off the soaking, icy layers and pulled on the coarse, oversized shirts and woolen trousers. The fabric was rough, but the dryness was a miracle. Rowan laid the other dry blankets on the floor, creating a thick, soft pallet against the far wall. He sat, his back against the rough adobe, and held one side of the top blanket open. She looked at him for a moment in the dim light. Then she came and lay down beside him, not touching, but close. He draped the heavy wool over both of them, tucking it in, creating a warm, shared cocoon. They lay on their backs, side by side, staring up at the darkness of the high, beamed ceiling. The sound of the rain was a lullaby. The horse stamped and sighed in the corner, its own warmth adding to the room. "When I was a girl," Nava said, her voice soft, disembodied in the dark. "My mother told me the rain was the sound of the ancestors weeping for the world, to wash it clean." "My father," Rowan murmured, "said it was just a good day to fix harnesses." He felt more than saw. Her small smile. "He is not a bad man," she said. "Kozani, he is lost. He followed my husband like a shadow. When my husband died, the shadow had nowhere to fall. He sold you, Nava, for whiskey." Rowan's voice was harder than he intended. "He sold his honor," she whispered. "He does not know how to live. You live, you stay, you build fences. You are quiet. I am quiet because I never had anyone to talk to," he said, the admission raw in the darkness. "You are talking now." He turned his head on the pallet to look at her. Her silhouette was all he could see. "I'm afraid for tomorrow. This pastor, he is one man. Vance has Merriweather. He has Dorn. He has your brother. We have the truth," she said. "You said it yourself. The first survey is the true survey." He felt her hand move under the blanket, searching for his. His fingers found hers. They were not cold anymore. They were warm and dry and strong. They laced together. "I have not felt this," he said, his voice thick. "This quiet. With another person. Ever." "Me neither," she breathed. "Since the stone." "I thought my heart was a dead thing. A dry spring." He squeezed her hand. "It's not." They lay like that, their hands clasped, their hearts beating in a steady, even rhythm under the warm, shared fabric. They talked of the land. She told him of the herbs that grew in the high rocks, the ones that could draw out fever. He told her of his father's dream of raising sheep, not cattle, because the wool was more honest. They did not speak of love. They did not speak of a future. They spoke of the things that made them who they were, and in doing so, they built a house, in the dark, that was stronger than the cabin Dorn's men had wrecked. It was a night told in quiet breaths, and clasped hands, and the discovery of a shared rhythm. Sometime before dawn, the rain stopped. The silence that fell was absolute. Rowan must have drifted off. He awoke to a faint gray light filtering through a crack in the shed door. He was on his side. Sometime in the night, she had turned toward him. Her face, inches from his, was relaxed in sleep. The lines of worry and war erased. The bruise was just a shadow. He watched her breathe. He watched the way her eyelashes rested on her cheek. Her eyes opened. They were not the eyes of a warrior, startled from ambush. They were slow and soft and clear. She looked at him, and she knew exactly where she was. And then she smiled. It was not the small, sharp lift of the mouth he had seen before. It was a true smile, a slow, unguarded sunrise that lit her entire face, that reached her eyes, crinkling the corners. It was the most beautiful, devastating thing he had ever seen. He did not kiss her. He could not. The moment was too pure. He simply moved his arm, the one she was not lying on, and wrapped it around her, pulling her close. It was a solid, certain embrace. He held her firmly, his hands spread flat on her back, her face tucked into the warmth of his neck. It was not a lover's caress. It was a contract. It was a promise. It was the signing of a deed. "You are safe. I am here. We are real." She let out a soft, contented sigh and burrowed closer, and for a few more minutes, as the dawn broke cold and gray over the Mesquite Divide. They were just two people, warm in a world that had, for one night, left them alone. The gray, watery light of dawn was a betrayal. It promised a clean world, a new start. But the air in the narrow pass of Devil's Ribbon was cold and heavy, thick with the smell of wet pine and ozone. The night of shared warmth in the shed felt like a dream from another life. Now, reality was the suck and pull of the mud on the horse's hooves, the ache in Rowan's legs, and the weight of the oilcloth package under his coat. They rode past the first switchback, a narrow defile where the red rock walls rose up 100 feet on either side. It was a natural funnel, a place where the water raged in a flash flood. A single shot cracked the morning. It was not a hunting rifle. It was a pistol, fired high. The bullet sang off the rock wall far above their heads, the sound ricocheting, echoing down the canyon like a dozen shots at once. "Rowan!" Nava's voice was sharp in his ear. Rowan hauled back on the reins. The horse sidestepped, snorting, its eyes white. They were not alone. Blocking the pass ahead, not 30 yards away, was Elias Dorn. He was on foot, his duster pushed back, a smoking revolver in his hand. He was not smiling. Flanking him were two hard-case men Rowan had never seen, both holding rifles. "That's far enough, Pike," Dorn's voice boomed, flat and cold. From the rocks behind them, two more figures emerged, cutting off their retreat. Rowan felt Nava go rigid behind him. He looked over his shoulder. It was Kozani. His face was bare, no mask. His features a twisted mask of whiskey, shame, and a terrible, misplaced anger. Beside him stood the other Apache warrior from the ranch. They were trapped. 5 men. "The book, Pike," Dorn said, taking a step closer. He holstered his pistol, a gesture of absolute, arrogant control. "And the brass marker. Put them on the ground. Then you can go." "Like you let Nava's husband go," Rowan shot back, his hand tightening on the Winchester still in its scabbard. Dorn's eyes went flat. "Get off the horse, slowly. Hands where I can see them." "Do it, Rowan," Nava whispered, her breath hot on his neck. Rowan swung his leg over, his boots hitting the thick mud. He raised his hands. Nava slid down after him. One of Dorn's men moved in, his rifle level. He ripped the Winchester from the scabbard. He searched Rowan, his hands rough, patting him down. He felt the hard rectangle of the journal under Rowan's coat. "Got it, boss," the man grunted. He pulled the oilcloth package out and tossed it to Dorn. Dorn caught it. He didn't open it. He just weighed it in his hand. "Good. Now, we finish this." "You said you'd let us go," Rowan said, his heart sinking. "I'm a Pinkerton, son," Dorn said, a thin smile touching his lips. "I'm licensed to deal with threats, and you," he nodded at Nava, "are a threat to the Silver Meridian's progress, and you," he looked at Rowan, "are a witness." He drew his pistol again. "Tie him to the snag." The two riflemen grabbed Rowan. He struggled, a blind, useless panic. But they were strong. They slammed him against the dead, stripped trunk of a juniper tree, yanking his arms back around it. They bound his wrists with a length of rough hemp rope. The bark bit into his back. "Dorn!" Nava shouted. She had not moved. She stood by the horse, her hands at her sides, the warrior in full command. "This is not his fight. This is between you and me." Dorn looked at her, his gaze lingering. "You're right, sweetheart. It is." He looked at Kozani. "You know the deal. Her, for the rifles. Take her." Kozani took a step, his eyes on his sister. He looked sick. "No," Nava said. Kozani stopped. "The deal is off," Nava said, her voice clear and carrying in the canyon. "You do not get the rifles, and you do not get me." Dorn laughed. "You're in no position to bargain. You've got nothing." "Let him go," Nava said, nodding at Rowan. "Let the rancher go. He's nobody. He's seen nothing. Let him go, and I will show you where the real maps are. The ones your men missed. The ones that show the silver deposits." It was a brilliant lie. Rowan watched, his heart pounding. Dorn's eyes narrowed. "You're lying." "Am I?" Nava took a step toward him. "Why would he keep one book? My people have known this land for 1,000 seasons. We know every rock, every spring, every vein of ore. You want the water. I can give you the silver." She took another step. The guard between her and Dorn raised his rifle. "That's close enough." Kozani was watching her, his expression unreadable. Nava looked at the guard, then at Dorn. She looked at Rowan, her gaze holding his for just a second. Then she looked at the ground. She seemed to stumble, her ankle turning in the thick mud. "Please," she whispered, her voice suddenly breaking, becoming the voice of a weak, terrified woman. "Please, I need—" She sank to her knees, as if her strength had given out. She was 10 feet from Rowan. The guard nearest her laughed. "Not so tough now." He looked at Dorn. His attention shifted. "What do we do, boss?" Dorn was considering the offer, the greed warring with his caution. Rowan saw it. He saw Nava, on her knees in the mud. He saw her head bowed, and he saw her right hand move, a flicker of motion. So fast it was almost invisible. It slid down to the top of her worn moccasin. "She's lying!" Kozani suddenly yelled, his voice cracking. "She's— Sister, don't—" But it was too late. Nava exploded upward. She was not stumbling. She was launching. In her hand was the white, milky blade of the bone knife. "Now!" she screamed. She did not go for Dorn. She went for the guard nearest her. She slammed her body into his, not with the knife, but with her shoulder, driving him off balance. His rifle went off, the shot thundering into the dirt. At the same instant, she lunged past him, toward Rowan. She did not try to untie him. She slashed, the bone blade, sharper than steel, severed the thick hemp rope with a single, upward cut. Rowan was free. "Into the yucca!" she shouted. He didn't think. He shoved himself away from the tree and dove, rolling into a thick, spiny cluster of high desert yucca. The sharp leaves were like daggers, ripping at his clothes and face, but he was covered. Chaos. The guard Nava had shoved was scrambling to his feet. Dorn was firing, his shots wild. "Kill them! Kill them both!" Nava did not run. She grabbed the stunned guard's rifle, yanking it from his grasp. She spun, dropping to one knee behind a slab of red rock, and levered around into the chamber. A shot kicked up mud near her head. It was the second rifleman. Nava returned fire. The sound of the Winchester was a deep-throated roar, so much louder than Dorn's pistol. The rifleman cried out and ducked for cover. It was a standoff. 3 of them, Dorn, the rifleman, and the first guard were pinned behind an overturned rock slide. Kozani and his companion were trapped by the canyon entrance. And then Rowan saw Kozani. He was half hidden behind a boulder, his own rifle in his hands, but he was not firing. He was staring at Nava, his face a mask of agony. "Talikai!" Nava's voice rang out, sharp and pained. She was using a name Rowan had never heard. "Little wolf, look at me!" Kozani flinched, as if she had struck him. "This is who you are!" she cried, her voice breaking not with weakness, but with a terrible, bleeding sorrow. "You are his dog. You sell the graves of our family for his whiskey. You sell me." "Sister, he stammered, lowering the rifle. "Fire, you damn fool!" Dorn roared from his position. He saw the hesitation. He shoved the rifleman. "Kill her! Kill her now!" But the rifleman was pinned. Dorn was a pistol man, and they were out of his range. He looked around, his eyes frantic, and saw the flicker of Rowan's shirt through the yucca. "Get the rancher!" Dorn bellowed. He took aim, his pistol arm steady on the rock. He fired. Rowan heard the zing of the bullet an instant before he felt it. It was not a thud. It was a white-hot poker, a line of fire that seared across his left shoulder. He cried out, a sharp, choked grunt, and fell back, the yucca spines piercing his back. Nava heard it. Her head snapped toward the sound. The fight was over. Her eyes, which had been cold with battle, filled with a sudden, terrible fear. Rowan. She made her choice. She stood. She raised the rifle and fired, not aiming, just firing. Bam, bam, bam. She emptied the gun, the shots echoing like thunder, forcing Dorn and his men to duck. She threw the empty rifle at them. "Run!" She screamed at Rowan. "Back! Up the ridge!" She plunged into the yucca. Ignoring the spines, she found him, his face pale, his hand clutching his shoulder. "Can you move?" "I think so," he gasped. "Then move!" She grabbed his good arm and hauled him to his feet. They scrambled, half running, half falling, out of the yucca and up the steep, rocky side of the canyon. "They're getting away!" Dorn was reloading, his voice frantic with rage. A shot pinged off the rock just past Rowan's head. He stumbled, but Nava held him up. They reached the top of the ridge, a low saddle of rock, and fell over the other side, out of the line of fire. They didn't stop. They ran for another 100 yards before Nava shoved him down behind a cluster of boulders. "Let me see," she commanded, her voice ragged. Rowan was gasping, his vision graying at the edges. Be quiet." Her hands were on him, ripping the sleeve of the coarse shirt. The air hit the wound, and he hissed. It was not as bad as it felt. The bullet had torn a 4-inch trough across the top of his shoulder muscle, a deep, clean graze. But it was bleeding. It was bleeding badly, the thick, dark blood running down his arm. Nava did not hesitate. She tore a long strip from the hem of her own borrowed shirt. She wadded half of it into a thick pad and pressed it, hard, into the wound. Rowan yelled, the pain blinding him. "Hold it," she ordered, grabbing his good hand and forcing it onto the pad. "Press, hard, as hard as you can." She used the rest of the cloth to bind the wound, wrapping it tight around his shoulder and chest, creating a brutally efficient pressure bandage. Her hands were quick, sure, and covered in his blood. "Can you walk?" she asked. He nodded, his jaw clenched. "Then we walk." They left the horse. They left everything. They moved south, keeping to the high ground. A grim, painful trek toward St. Elmo's Fork. They arrived 2 hours later, Rowan stumbling, pale as ash, held up by Nava's iron-willed strength. The church was a small, whitewashed adobe building. A man was in the yard, tending a small, struggling garden. He was a small, thin man in a worn black coat, with spectacles and a gentle, worried face. He looked up as they approached, and his eyes widened. "Good Lord," he said, dropping his trowel. He looked at Rowan's bloody shoulder, at Nava's bruised face. "In the name of mercy, get inside." He was Abel Sutter, and he was, as Rowan's father had said, an honest man. He cleaned the wound with hot water and carbolic, his touch surprisingly firm. He stitched the worst of it with a neat, practiced hand, clucking his tongue. "You are lucky, son. An inch lower." Rowan, his shoulder throbbing, told him everything. He told him about the journal, the murder, Merriweather, Dorn, and the ambush. Sutter listened, his gentle face hardening. When Rowan was finished, the pastor nodded slowly. "I knew it," he said, his voice quiet. "I knew Harlan Merriweather was a man for sale, but this—" He looked at Nava. "They murdered your husband for that water." "And they will keep murdering," Nava said. "No." Sutter stood. his slight frame filled with a sudden, cold anger. "No, they will not. Caleb Vance is holding a celebration. In 3 days, he is driving the Golden Spike for his new line. He has invited the Arizona Gazette. He wants the world to see his triumph." Sutter's eyes met Rowan's. "He is building his monument on a foundation of lies, and he has invited the press to witness it." Rowan looked at Nava. "It's our one chance." "It is," Sutter agreed. "Judge Merriweather himself will be the keynote speaker. It will be a perfect stage. We will give the Gazette a different story." That night, Rowan lay on a small cot in Sutter's study, his shoulder a universe of pulsing fire. Nava sat by the open window, a still silhouette against the moonlight. "He will be there," she said, her voice so low Rowan almost missed it. "Kozani, he will be there, guarding his new master." He made his choice, Rowan said, his voice thick with the laudanum Sutter had given him. "He is my blood," she whispered. "He is all that is left. When this is done, the law will come. They will look for everyone who was in that canyon." Rowan did not know what to say. "My husband's blood must be paid for," Nava said, turning to look at him. "But my brother's life, it is not Dorn's to take, or the law's." "Nava, what are you saying?" "I am the eldest sister," she said, her voice flat and absolute. "The guilt is mine. He is a lost boy, but I am his blood. When the time comes, in front of them all, I will say I was the one. I will say I forced him. I will say I led the ambush. I will pay the debt." "Nava, no!" Rowan tried to sit up, but the pain threw him back. That's a lie? They'll hang you." "It is the only law I have left," she said, turning back to the window. "It is my decision. Now sleep. You will need your strength." The square in front of warehouse number 3 was a theater of lies. It was a patch of cleared mud, churned by the recent rain. But Caleb Vance had dressed it for a coronation, red, white, and blue bunting, already stained with rust and mud, drooped from the eaves. On a makeshift wooden platform, a small, nervous church choir sang a reedy version of Columbia, the Gem of the Ocean, their voices thin against the wind. The town had turned out. A restless mix of merchants promised a boom, ranchers promised shipping rates, and laborers promised work. Caleb Vance stood at the center of the platform. He was magnificent in a black broadcloth suit, his vest a rich brocade, his cravat perfectly knotted. He held the prop, a ceremonial hammer, gleaming with fresh gold paint. Beside him, Judge Harlan Merriweather beamed, his silver hair slicked down with pomade, his smile as thin and sharp as a filed blade. He was the picture of civic authority. At the edge of the crowd, leaning against an alley wall, Elias Dorn watched. His duster was unbuttoned, his hand resting casually near the pistol at his hip. He was not watching the stage. He was scanning the faces in the crowd, a shepherd for his wolves. Rowan stood near the back, his left arm in a sling beneath his coat, the wound a dull, heavy fire. Beside him, Nava was a column of stillness, her face unreadable, her eyes missing nothing. Pastor Sutter was at their side, his hands clasped so tightly his knuckles were white. Vance raised the golden hammer. The choir mercifully fell silent. "Today," Vance boomed, his voice rolling over the assembly. "Today, we do not just drive a spike. We drive the spike of civilization itself. We connect this great and vital territory to the commerce of a nation. A new era of prosperity begins here, in this square, on this land, secured for us all by the laws of the United States." He gestured to Merriweather, who stepped forward, preening. "And by the authority vested in me, and affirmed by this territory's finest jurist, Judge Harlan Merriweather, we claim this valley for progress." A scattered applause began. "Stop!" The voice was not loud, but it was clear, and it cut through the air like a clean blade. The applause faltered, died. Pastor Abel Sutter pushed his way through the crowd. He was a small man, looking smaller still in his worn black coat, but he walked with the conviction of a prophet. He stopped at the foot of the platform. Vance's face darkened. Merriweather's smile froze. Across the square, Dorn pushed himself off the wall. His eyes narrowed. "Mr. Vance!" Sutter called out, his voice shaking but gaining strength. "You speak of the law. Let us, then, speak of the true law." This is not the time. "Pastor," Merriweather snapped, his tone laced with venom. "This is a celebration." "It is a reckoning," Sutter replied. He raised his hand. In it, he held the leather-bound journal and the dull brass marker. "I hold here the original United States survey of the Mesquite Divide, filed in 1871, filed before your railroad charter. Mr. Vance, filed before your fraudulent deeds. Judge Merriweather." A shocked murmur rippled through the crowd. A man at the front, with a notepad and pencil, began scribbling furiously. Rowan recognized him from the Arizona Gazette. "This map," Sutter's voice rose, finding its preacher's cadence, "shows the Saguaro Wash Spring, and it does not lie on your land. It does not lie on territorial land. It lies here." He stabbed a finger at the map. "On unceded Apache territory." "Lies," Vance roared. "Insubordination slander." "Is it?" Sutter did not flinch. He held up the small, folded receipt. "And is this slander a receipt for $500 paid to you, Judge Merriweather, from Vance's private holding company, for the expedited filing of a false land charter?" The crowd gasped. This was not slander. This was evidence. "He speaks the truth." Nava stepped out from beside Sutter. She was not the rain-soaked woman from the shed. She wore her own buckskin, her bearing regal. The dark bruise on her cheek was a mark of defiance. She walked to the platform, and the crowd parted for her. She stood before Vance and Merriweather, an equal. She looked at the assembly, her gaze sweeping over the ranchers, the merchants, the women. "The Saguaro Wash is the lifeblood of my ancestors," she said, her English clear and sharp. "It is not for sale." Then she turned her gaze to the small contingent of Native and Mexican families at the back, the ones who usually lived in the shadows of the town. Her voice changed, flowing into the liquid, strong syllables of her own tongue. She was not asking for help. She was declaring a fact. She turned back to Vance, her eyes finding his. "And I have another truth. The ambush at Ash Mesa, the survey crew my husband went to question. It was not a raid. It was an assassination, ordered by you, carried out by your man." Her gaze shifted, finding him. Elias Dorn. The names, assassination and Dorn, hung in the heavy, silent air. Dorn saw it all unraveling. He saw the Gazette reporter. He saw the doubt on the ranchers' faces. He stopped being a guard and became a tool. He lunged. He did not go for Nava. He went for Sutter. For the book. "I'll take that, preacher," he snarled. Sutter was a small man. Dorn was a bull. He would have crushed him. But Rowan was already moving. His left shoulder was a mass of screaming fire, but he did not use it. He pivoted, leading with his right side, and slammed his good shoulder into Dorn's charging chest. It was like hitting a stampeding steer. The impact was brutal. A fresh, blinding wave of pain exploded in Rowan's wounded side, and a sharp cry was punched from his lungs. But the angle was right. Dorn was knocked off balance. His lunge diverted. He stumbled, roaring in fury, and crashed into the platform steps. The crowd screamed. It was the breaking point. People shoved backward, a wave of panic. A woman fainted. Horses tied to the hitching rail reared and whinnied, their eyes white. It was chaos. Dorn recovered in an instant. He saw Rowan, clutching his wounded shoulder, staggering but still on his feet. "You," Dorn spat, his face purple with rage. He drew his pistol. "You should have died in that canyon. Stop!" The shout came from above, from the roof of warehouse number 3. Kozani. He stood silhouetted against the pale sky, a bow in his hand. An arrow was nocked, the string drawn back, the obsidian tip aimed steadily at the center of Dorn's chest. Dorn froze, his pistol halfway raised. The square fell silent. Kozani's gaze was not on Dorn. It was locked on his sister. He had been there. He had heard it all. He had heard her speak of her husband's death, not as a private suspicion, but as a public accusation. He saw the hundreds of faces, white, Mexican, Apache, all turned, listening to her truth. His face was a mask of agony. He saw the woman he had struck. He saw the sister whose honor he was supposed to protect, the sister whose husband he had helped avenge, not with honor, but by selling himself for whiskey and guns. "Kozani," Nava said. Her voice was not angry. It was soft, aching, and it carried in the terrible silence. "Talikai, little wolf, it is done." Dorn saw the hesitation. He saw the connection. He saw his opening. He snapped his pistol arm up, ignoring the bow, aiming not at Kozani, but at Nava. Rowan, seeing the motion, yelled. He had no strength left, but he threw himself forward in a desperate, clumsy tackle. He hit Dorn's arm, not his body. The pistol fired. The shot went wild. It missed Nava. It missed everyone. The bullet screamed across the square and struck the massive, cast-iron bell hanging in the tower of the firehouse next door. The clang was a single, deafening explosion of sound. It was not a ring. It was a judgment, a punctuation mark of iron that shuddered through the bones of everyone present. In that moment of stunned silence, Judge Harlan Merriweather lost his nerve, the slick pomade, the sharp suit. It all melted. He saw the armed Apache on the roof, the bloodied rancher on the ground, the angry, accusing eyes of the crowd. "Arrest them!" he shrieked, his voice a high-pitched squeal. He pointed a shaking finger at Neva. "Arrest that woman. She's the ringleader. She's conspiring. She attacked an officer." But there was no marshal. There were only Vance's hired men, and they were looking at Dorn, who was struggling to throw Rowan off his legs. Merriweather's panic was his final mistake. His accusation broke the crowd's spell. Jed Olson, the scarecrow rancher who had lost his water, stepped forward. "She ain't the one lying, Judge," he said, his voice flat. Then, a Mexican woman who ran the tortilla shop, a woman Merriweather had fined twice last month, stepped out. She stood next to Jed, then two loggers, covered in sawdust and owed back pay by Vance's company, moved up. Then, the native women at the back, the ones Nava had spoken to, moved forward. They did not come with weapons. They came with presence. They formed a line, a human wall. They stood between Merriweather and Nava. They were the farmers, the loggers, the washers, the displaced, and they were, finally, done being pushed. On the roof, Kozani watched. He saw his sister, protected not by her blood, not by warriors, but by the very people he had been taught to despise. He looked down at Dorn, who had finally kicked Rowan away. Dorn raised his pistol, his face a mask of hate, aiming for a final, finishing shot at the man on the ground. Kozani lowered his bow. He shifted his aim. The obsidian tip pointed directly at Dorn. "We no longer sell our souls," he said, his voice clear. That was all it took. The crowd surged. It was not a riot. It was a tide. The loggers, the ranchers. They fell on Dorn and his two men. Jed Olson himself twisted the pistol from Dorn's hand. Rowan, gasping in the mud, looked up. He saw Caleb Vance, his face white, his suit spattered, his golden hammer lying forgotten in the dirt. The Gazette reporter was in his face, his pencil flying, shouting questions about murder, about fraud, about the saguaro wash. The stage had been set. The spike had been driven. But it was not Caleb Vance's triumph. It was the unmasking. The performance was over. The cicada, stripped of its shell, was left blinking in the harsh, accusing light of the midday sun. The single, deafening clang of the fire bell seemed to break the spine of the conspiracy. What followed was not a riot. It was a judgment. The crowd did not surge with mindless violence. It moved with a cold, focused purpose. Caleb Vance, his face the color of old parchment, stood frozen on the platform. The golden hammer lay in the mud at his feet. The Gazette reporter, his eyes alive, was shouting questions. But Vance did not hear him. He was a statue of arrogance, suddenly hollow. Two of the loggers he had cheated mounted the platform, grabbed his arms, and pulled him down. He did not resist. His reign, built on paper and force, had dissolved. Judge Harlan Merriweather did not wait. He was not a fighter. He was a runner. Seeing the tide turn, seeing Dorn go down, he scrambled from the back of the platform. His slick, polished shoe, the one he had shined that morning, sank deep into the churned mud. He pulled, frantic, and his foot came free, but the shoe remained, a small, black tombstone in the muck. He half ran, half limped, one-shoed, toward the alley, disappearing like the coward he was. Elias Dorn was a professional. He had stopped struggling. He lay on his back, the wind knocked from him, his nose bleeding from Rowan's tackle. Jed Olson stood over him, holding Dorn's own pistol, the barrel pointed steadily at the Pinkerton's chest. "It's over. Dorn," Jed said, his voice flat. Dorn just stared at the gray sky, calculating his chances, and knew they were zero. The loggers brought the rope they had used for the bunting and, with a grim efficiency, tied his hands. Pastor Sutter stepped onto the platform. He raised his thin hands. "Listen, listen, people!" The square, which had been a low roar, quieted. "This is not our justice to give." Sutter called out, his voice clear. "We will send for the federal marshal. We will give him the evidence. We will give him these men." He pointed to Vance and Dorn, who were now being guarded by a half-dozen grim-faced ranchers. "But until he arrives," Sutter continued, "we, the people of this valley, must act. I propose a citizens' committee to protect this evidence and to protect our water." He looked at the crowd. "The Saguaro Wash Spring will be held in public trust. Its water will be shared equally by all until the federal court in Tucson can affirm the truth of this map." A cheer went up. It was not a cheer of victory. It was a cheer of relief. Rowan was still on the ground, pushing himself up, his good arm trembling. The pain in his shoulder was a blinding, white-hot sheet. He looked up, and the crowd parted. Nava was walking toward him. But she did not stop. She walked past him, her gaze fixed on the roof of the warehouse. Kozani was still there, the bow still in his hand, a ghost against the sky. He watched his sister, his face unmoving. Then, slowly, he lowered the bow and disappeared. A moment later, he emerged from the warehouse alley. The crowd, sensing this was a different kind of justice, moved back, giving them a wide circle in the mud. Kozani walked toward his sister. He was not the whiskey-drunk boy from the cabin. He was not the angry warrior from the canyon. He was someone else, hollowed out. His eyes burned clear of everything but a terrible, profound shame. He stopped 3 feet in front of her. He did not speak. He did not ask for forgiveness. Slowly, he unstrapped the knife from his belt. It was not the one he carried. It was an older, heavier blade, the handle wrapped in worn leather, the pommel a single piece of turquoise. He knelt in the mud, his head bowed. He placed the knife on the ground. At her feet, it was their father's knife, the symbol of his honor, his place as a warrior, his right to lead. "Talikai," Nava whispered. "Little wolf, I am no longer a warrior," Kozani said, his voice thick, speaking in their own tongue. "I am a ghost. I followed a liar. I drank his poison. I raised my hand against my blood." He looked up, and his eyes were leaking tears, which he did not wipe away. "I accept the judgment. I will leave. I will go to the salt lands. For 1 season, I will not hunt. I will not speak. I will carry only this shame." He was banishing himself. It was the deepest atonement he could offer. Nava stared at the knife. She stared at her brother, the boy she had raised, the man who had betrayed her. Her decision from the night before, to take his guilt, died. He had to own this. He had to carry it. "Go, then," she said, her voice hard, but not cold. "Go and become a man, or do not come back." She did not pick up the knife. Kozani nodded once. He stood, turned his back on his sister, on his home, and walked out of the square. He did not look back. The crowd slowly began to disperse. Men were talking in low, urgent voices. The Gazette reporter was interviewing Sutter. Jed Olson was organizing a guard for the prisoners. Rowan had finally made it to his feet. He was leaning against a porch post, his face pale, sweat beading on his forehead. The pain was making him dizzy. Nava came to him. She stood in front of him, the wall of people she had built now gone. The adrenaline faded, the battle won, and in its place, the future rushed in, vast and terrifying. "You are hurt," she said, her voice quiet. "I'll live," he gasped. You did it. Nava, you spoke the truth." She looked away from him, out at the churned mud, at the place where Kozani had knelt. "I spoke, and in doing so, I have cut the last rope." Rowan frowned, not understanding. "What do you mean?" She turned back to him, her eyes searching his. The gaze was heavy, freighted with the cost of the day. "Rowan, to my people, I am no longer the eldest sister. I refused the marriage. I defied my blood. I stood with you, against them. I have no name. I have no tribe." She took a breath, and the words were the final, heaviest price. "If I stay here, with you, I am a ghost. I am dead in the name of my people." Rowan felt the words like a physical blow. He had won his ranch, his water, but he was about to lose her. He looked at this woman, this impossible, strong, wounded woman who had saved him in every way that mattered. He thought of his empty cabin. He thought of his solitary life. He reached out with his good hand, not to hold her, but to just touch her arm. "Then I won't ask you to stay," he said, his voice hoarse. "I am not asking you to be a ghost. I am not asking you to choose me. I am asking if I can walk beside you. Wherever you go, if you go to the mountains, I'll sell this place. If you go north, I'll follow." He was fumbling the words, but he had to make her understand. "I am not trying to keep you, Nava. I am just asking to go with you." She stared at him. She saw the honesty in his pain-filled eyes. She saw a man who was not trying to possess her, but to join her. A man who was willing to give up his own land, the very thing they had just fought for, to be her partner. She looked away, past him. She looked at the Dry Comet Ranch, a speck of brown in the far distance. She looked at the glistening line of the saguaro wash, now visible in the clear, rain-washed air. She looked at the faces of the people in the square, the Mexican woman from the tortilla shop, who was now helping Sutter write down names, the Apache widows, who had watched her, their faces filled with a new, strange hope. She had a choice. She could leave, become a true ghost, and find freedom in anonymity, or she could stay and build a new kind of name. "Walk," she said, a small, hard smile touching her lips. She looked back at him. "No, Rowan, we will not walk, and we will not run." She stood up straighter. "We will build." Rowan looked at her, confused. "Build what?" "A home," she said. "Here. In the Mesquite Divide, I am not dead. I am free, and I will use that freedom to build a place where trade is fair, where a hide is worth a bag of flour, where no one, not Apache, not Mexican, not a lone rancher, has to bow to a man like Vance." It was a declaration. It was the founding of a new nation, a nation of one, in the middle of the town square. It began that day. They did not go back to the ranch. They went to the small, adobe homes at the edge of town, where the other outcasts lived. Nava spoke to the Apache widows whose husbands had also been killed by Dorn's men. Rowan spoke to Jed Olson, and to the loggers. They formed a new thing. They called it the Saguaro Cooperative. It was built on what they had. Nava and the widows had the knowledge of tanning, of herbs, of the land. Rowan and Jed had the ranching skills, the knowledge of horses. The loggers had the strength. The Mexican women had the corn and the trade routes. They pooled their skills. They would trade leather for lumber, herbs for food. They would breed horses, combining Rowan's sturdy stock with the endurance of the Apache ponies. The rumor spread across the territory. It was a strange, improbable story, the kind that only the desert could create, the story of the quiet, solitary rancher, the one they called the Virgin Rancher, and the tall, dangerous Apache warrior, the White Mountain eldest sister. the story of how they had faced down the railroad. Armed with nothing but a dead man's map and the truth, they were building a home, not on a lie, not with stolen water, but on the dead, hard land that everyone had abandoned. They were turning the dust into a foundation. 3 months passed. The wind in the Mesquite Divide still had no manners. But the landscape had changed. The Dry Comet Ranch was no longer dry, and it was no longer the mark of a man just passing through. The fence lines, the ones Rowan had fought with, were now strung tight and true as a guitar string. He had not built them alone. Jed Olson, the loggers, and 2 other ranchers whose land had been threatened by Vance's scheme had come and worked for a week, paid in flour, salt pork, and credit from the new Saguaro Cooperative. The cabin, once wrecked, was now solid. The pantry was full. But the real change was outside, near the porch, where the ground had been baked hard and sterile. A garden grew. It was Nava's. She had tilled the stubborn earth, mixing it with silt from the wash, and planted the things she knew: wild thyme, sage, bishop's weed, and echinacea. The air, which had always smelled of dust and sun, now carried the sharp, clean scent of herbs and life. And the water, the Saguaro wash spring, the artery they had fought for, was now the heart of the valley. Following the lines of the true survey, Rowan and Pastor Sutter had designed a simple, elegant aqueduct of split logs, a series of numbered wooden valves, carved by Nava's steady hand, diverted the stream. Valve 1 went to the rancher's troughs. Valve 2 fed the public cistern in town. Valve 3, the largest, went to the new settlement of adobe homes where the Apache widows and the displaced Mexican families were building their own co-op. It was not a perfect system, but it was fair, and in the Arizona Territory, fairness was a rarer thing than water. One morning, just as the sun was turning the high peaks a pale, blushing peach, Rowan stood on the rebuilt porch. He held a tin cup of hot coffee, the steam rising in the cold air. His left shoulder was no longer in a sling. It was just a thick, puckered scar, a permanent reminder of the canyon. He was not looking at the fences, or the garden. He was watching Nava in the corral. She was not working. She was communicating. She was in the round pen with a new mare, a smoky gray filly with a wild eye and a distrust of all things human. Nava had no rope. She had no saddle, no bridle. She stood in the center of the pen, her body relaxed, her hands loose at her sides. The mare, nervous, stamped and snorted, trotting in a tight, anxious circle. Nava did not move toward it. She just breathed. Rowan watched, mesmerized. He had seen men break horses. He had never seen this. Nava inhaled when the horse inhaled. She exhaled when the horse exhaled. A long, slow sigh. She matched its rhythm, its fear, its life. She became a mirror. Slowly, the mare's circles widened. Its steps became less frantic. It slowed to a walk. It stopped, its ears pricked, its gaze fixed on the woman. Nava took one slow step. The mare held its ground. Another step. Nava lifted her hand, palm open, and laid it gently on the horse's trembling, smoke-colored neck. The mare shuddered, but did not pull away. It leaned into her touch. Nava closed her eyes, her lips moving in a soundless murmur, her breath and the horse's breath one and the same. It was a form of love. It was a language of pure trust, spoken in a way Rowan was only just beginning to learn. After a few minutes, Nava stroked the horse's neck one last time and walked to the fence. She vaulted it in a single, fluid motion and joined him on the porch. The morning cold was sharp, and she sat close, her shoulder and hip pressing against his. The shared warmth was immediate, familiar. She looked at the tin cup in his hand. She did not ask. She simply reached out and took it from him. Their fingers brushed. It was not the accidental, electric spark of the barn. This was a known thing, a comfort. His thumb grazed the back of her hand, her skin warm, his calloused and rough. The touch lingered, a quiet conversation that lasted a second longer than it needed to. Nava took a long, slow sip of the hot coffee, her eyes on the rising sun. She passed the cup back to him, and she smiled. It was the smile he had seen in the shed, the slow, unguarded sunrise of a smile. But it was not a rare thing anymore. It was still devastating, but it was no longer a miracle. It was a fact. It was the smile of a woman who was no longer bracing for a blow. A woman who had found her ground. "Do you ever regret it?" Rowan asked, his voice low, almost lost in the vast morning. "Staying, building all this, giving up." He did not know how to finish. "Your people, your name." She was quiet for a long moment, watching the light flood the valley, turning the distant dust to gold. "Regret," she said, her voice soft. "I traded a name I was given for a voice I have earned. I traded a bloodline that tried to own me for a freedom I had never known." She turned her head, her dark eyes finding his in the clear light. "And I found a man who does not try to stand in front of me or behind me, but beside me. A man who sees me as his equal." She tapped the rim of the coffee cup he was holding. "Even if he makes coffee that is strong enough to poison a mule." He laughed. It was a real, easy sound that surprised him every time. It was a sound he had not made before her. "My father," he said, the memory clear and good. He had a saying. He always told me wealth was not about money or land. He said, "Wealth, son, is the moments, the ones that just steal your breath, the ones that make your heart stop and remind you that you are alive." Nava looked at him. The intensity of her gaze, the warrior's focus, softened. The survivor, the eldest sister, the fighter, all those women melted away, and there was just Nava. She laughed, a low, warm sound in her chest that he felt more than heard. She leaned in. She did not kiss his mouth. She kissed his forehead. She pressed her lips to the skin just above his brow, a touch that was not about passion, but about peace. It was a kiss of absolute belonging. It was a kiss that sealed a contract. It was the kiss of a home they had built together, from mud and truth and the wreckage of their past lives. "Then we are wealthy." Rowan Pike. She whispered against his skin. That night, the air was cool and sharp, the sky a spill of diamond chips. From the cooperative camp, half a mile down the wash, came the sound of a harmonica. Jed Olson, it turned out, could play. It was a slow, simple tune, a waltz that spoke of long days and quiet nights. It was a song that was a little sad and a little hopeful. Rowan and Nava were standing on the porch, having just finished clearing the dishes. He looked at her. He held out his good hand. He did not say a word. She looked at his hand, then at his face. She smiled that smile, and she took it. He drew her close. He was still a clumsy man. He was a rancher, not a dancer. His boots were heavy and his shoulders still stiff, but she did not care. He put his right hand on the small of her back. He felt the solid, warm strength of her, real and present through the thin cotton of her shirt. She rested her head on his good shoulder. They did not move much. They just swayed to the distant, mournful music. A slow dance. 2 steps left, 2 steps right, learning each other's rhythm. Their steps were hesitant at first, his boots scuffing the porch board. Then, they found it. They found the shared beat. He felt her breath, warm and steady, against his neck. She felt his heart, beating a strong, calm rhythm against her. They moved as one body. He buried his face in her hair, smelling the sage and the wood smoke that was just her. She looped her arms around his neck. They danced, foreheads touching, eyes closed, speaking a whole, complex language in the silence between the harmonica's notes. It was a promise. It was an arrival. The music faded. They stood, still holding each other, for a long, quiet moment. Nava lifted her head. Her eyes, which had been soft, were suddenly sharp. She was looking past him, to the east. "Dust," she said. Rowan turned. On the dark horizon, on the main road from Tucson, a plume of dust was rising against the moonlight. It was not a single rider. It was too large. A carriage, and at least 4 escorts. They were traveling fast. An hour later, Jed Olson rode in. His horse lathered. He threw himself from the saddle, his face grim. "It's true," he said, breathing hard. Pastor Sutter sent a rider. It's Merriweather. Rowan felt his stomach tighten. He came back. He did not just run. Jed spat. He ran to the Capitol. He's come back with federal lawyers, Rowan, and a marshal. He's claiming the Saguaro Cooperative is an illegal assembly. He's claiming the land survey is void. He's got a new injunction, one that says Nava is a hostile, and that you, he looked at Rowan, are harboring a fugitive from tribal law. The old, cold fear flickered in Rowan's gut. The urge to run, the urge to hide. A new storm, Jed said, his voice heavy. A storm of paper and badges, and it will be here by morning. Jed mounted up, to ride back and stand with Sutter. Rowan stood on the porch, the news a heavy, cold stone in the night air. He looked at the home he had just built. Nava came and stood beside him. She did not look afraid. She just looked ready. He looked at her strong profile in the moonlight, at the woman who had faced down her brother, and Dorn, and a whole town. He felt the last remnant of his old self, the solitary, frightened man. Burn away. He took her hand. His grip was solid. His hand was not shaking. Let them come, Rowan said. His voice was quiet, but it was as hard as iron. I am not that man anymore. I am not living my life to hide from them. He felt her fingers tighten, lacing with his. He turned to look at her. Her face was calm, her gaze fixed on the dark road where the new storm was gathering. Her eyes, in the pale light, seemed to hold a small, unquenchable fire. And if the storm comes, she whispered, her voice a vow in the gathering twilight, we will hold this roof together. He pulled her hand to his lips and kissed her knuckles. She leaned her head against his shoulder. They stood together, two small, unshakable figures in the vast, purple desert, watching the darkness and waiting for the dawn. Thank you so much for listening to our story. We would love to connect with you, so please comment below and let us know where you are listening from and share your thoughts. Be sure to subscribe to Wild West Stories 1850 like this video, and give us some extra support by hitting that hype button so this story can be heard by even more people.